Welcome to the Deep Dive, the show where we slice through stacks of information to get you to the good stuff.
Glad to be here.
Today, we're diving into a game that's pretty legendary for its sheer scope. I mean, it creates entire worlds before you even click start.
We're talking Dwarf Fortress, yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
A title known not just for its gameplay, but for this, frankly, unparalleled level of procedural world building.
It's truly a marvel. Seriously, imagine a system that just generates unique fantasy worlds totally from scratch.
Like the whole package.
The whole thing. Geography, biomes, entire civilizations, even languages, mythologies, sprawling histories. Oh, and bizarre creatures, down to written texts.
It's like having a digital Tolkien in your computer, but the story changes every single time you play.
Pretty much, yeah.
So our mission today is kind of twofold. First, we really want to unpack the intricate procedural systems that make these Dwarf Fortress worlds feel so alive, so uniquely rich.
Get under the hood a bit.
Right. Then we'll pivot and explore how these, well, groundbreaking techniques might be adapted, how you could use them to create dynamically generated, endlessly fresh multiplayer worlds.
Specifically for something like Ultima Online, like a ServUO server.
Exactly. For anyone less familiar, ServUO is basically a popular open-source server project for Ultima Online. It lets communities build their own custom UO shards.
So adapting DF's ideas means bringing this dynamic world building to those custom UO experiences people create.
Precisely.
And we'll be drawing on some pretty detailed research for this. Insights directly from Dwarf Fortress's creator, Tarn Adams, plus discussions on, how you'd actually translate these systems to a persistent online world.
So yeah, get ready to see how an entire universe gets forged, digitally speaking.
Let's do it.
Okay, let's start unpacking this. When Dwarf Fortress builds a world, it's not just like randomly dropping a hill here and a river there.
Not at all. It begins way more fundamentally with the terrain itself.
Foundation.
Right. The world generation kicks off by creating a randomized elevation map. It uses something called fractal noise. Tarn Adams specifically mentioned they use midpoint displacement.
Okay, midpoint displacement. Sounds technical, but is the basic idea like you paint a rough outline, then keep adding finer and finer detail, kind of like zooming in?
That's a good way to think about it, yeah. It's a fractal algorithm. It recursively subdivides the map and offsets the midpoints, laying down the basic structure for mountains, hills, valleys.
So it ensures mountains aren't just random bumps. They feel connected.
Exactly. They're part of a larger, natural-looking fractal pattern. Gives you varied heights right off the bat, not just a flat canvas.
Okay.
But crucially, it doesn't stop there. After that initial sort of synthetic height map, the game runs what they call a geological refinement phase.
Geological refinement.
Yeah, it involves a pretty basic hydraulic erosion simulation.
Simulating water flow.
It finds high points, simulates water flowing downhill, always picking the lowest path. If there's no lower path, it'll actually dig away squares to make one until it reaches an ocean level.
Ah, so that's how it carves out realistic river valleys and smooth things out.
Precisely. It gets rid of the blocky look from the initial algorithm and makes the rivers connect properly.
And the real magic happens when you combine that fractal noise with the erosion, right? That's where you get these landscapes that just look coherent.
That's it. You get believable coastlines, distinct mountain ranges, detailed river networks. It's really impressive stuff.
Now, you mentioned it sometimes biases mountains towards the center of continents. Is that just a quirk, or?
It's sort of a known characteristic of combining those specific techniques. A bit of a trade-off, really, for getting both the large-scale structure and the fine details using relatively simple methods.
So a classic procedural generation compromise.
Yeah, pretty much. They're always tweaking things, I'm sure, but for now, the overall result is definitely worth that minor bias.
So the key takeaway here isn't just, pretty maps. It's that this physical foundation dictates almost everything else that follows.
Spot on. It's not just aesthetics. It's deep systemic coherence. That elevation map directly influences temperature higher, is cooler, and rainfall, mountains creating rain shadows.
Right.
It defines the coastlines, obviously. All the low bits near the edge become ocean. And maybe most importantly, the river network shapes where civilizations can even settle. It affects history.
By providing travel routes and fertile land.
Exactly. It really is the physical stage for everything else.
Okay, so the stage is set, then the biomes appear. But you said it's not like they're just painted on afterwards.
No, and that's a really crucial distinction, a key insight, really. Tarn Adams put it like this. Biomes are not the basics. They arise from several factors. Temperature, rainfall, elevation, drainage.
Ah, okay. So the game generates other maps first. for climate.
Exactly. Auxiliary maps for temperature, rainfall, drainage, and these are influenced by things like latitude, elevation, the mountains blocking rain, etc.
So every little square on the map gets values for temperature, rain, drainage.
Correct. And then, based on those values, plus elevation and whether there's water, the game uses rule-based thresholds to classify each cell into a biome type.
Can you give an example?
Sure, like if rainfall is high, say over 66 on whatever scale they use, and drainage is poor, under 50, then bingo, you got a swamp.
Okay.
But high rainfall with good drainage, that might give you a dense forest, low rainfall, high temperature, obviously a desert. There's a whole set of rules like that.
And it works for water, too, like salt versus fresh water.
Yep, salinity is another factor, differentiates salt marshes from freshwater ones.
And then there are other layers,
Right.
like savagery.
Right. Savagery dictates how wild and dangerous a place is.
Yeah.
And there's also an alignment spectrum, sort of good versus evil magical influence.
So you could end up with, what, an evil forest full of undead spiders or something?
Exactly that kind of thing. Adds another layer of unique flavor and challenge.
And these areas don't just stay as, like, Tile 5 is swamp, right?
Yeah.
They get names.
Absolutely. Once every tile has its climate and provisional biome, the game looks for contiguous areas of the same type.
Uh-huh.
It merges them into named regions using procedural languages. So a big patch of connected temperate forest tiles might become, say, the silvery forest, or a nasty swamp area could be the murk of gators.
Okay, that immediately adds so much character.
It really does. And then flora and fauna are assigned to these named regions based on the biome type and latitude.
So oak trees pop up in temperate forests, cacti in deserts.
Wolves, elephants, you name it, everything's selected to kind of make sense for that environment. Apparently, Tarn Adams wants even more specific zoogeographic regions eventually, beyond just biome, which seems ambitious, frankly.
Yeah, just a bit.
But the core idea, this simulation-driven classification, is pretty revolutionary. Biomes emerge from the world's physics.
Which means you get natural transitions, right? Not like jarring squares changing instantly.
Exactly. No hard edges. And it even allows for dynamic shifts if the underlying parameters were to change during the world's history. Like, climate change could theoretically turn a forest into a desert over simulated centuries.
Wow. Okay, so the mountains are settled, the rivers are flowing, the biomes have emerged. But the world's still just a static canvas at this point, right?
Pretty much, yeah. Primed for life, but not alive yet.
So let's talk about how Dwarf Fortress breathes history and civilizations into these landscapes. How does it actually populate these new continents?
Right, so once the physical world is done, the generator starts populating it. It adds intelligent races, dwarves, humans, elves, goblins, and their initial societies.
The placing civilizations phase you see during World Gen.
That's the one. The generator looks for suitable biomes for each race. Dwarves tend to start in mountains, elves in forests, humans near rivers or coasts, goblins often near those evil regions we mentioned.
And they get those cool names, right? Like Yuzol Zulbin, Hall of Gold for a dwarven fortress.
Yep. Each starting site gets a culturally appropriate name using the race's own generated language, which is amazing for immersion, like you said.
Okay, so they place the starting towns. Then what? Does history start?
Then the real core of Dwarf Fortress world building kicks in. The historical simulation.
No. The famous part.
Yeah, it's
Okay.
basically an agent-based simulation. Civilizations grow, they found new sites as their populations expand, they form armies, they engage in diplomacy, they go to war, all over hundreds of simulated years.
So it's not predetermined history, it's actually playing out.
It's playing out year by year. It generates historical figures too, leaders, heroes, villains with unique appearances and personalities. These figures carry out notable actions like slaying monsters, usurping thrones.
And the game tracks all this.
Oh, yeah. Thousands upon thousands of events get recorded. Births, deaths, battles, treaties signed, artifacts created. It all accumulates into this incredibly rich legend for the world.
How does it keep that believable, though? Avoid it just feeling like random chaos.
Well, it's largely rule-based, but with a lot of randomness or stochasticity thrown in. There are subsystems managing demographic growth, how conflicts get resolved, who becomes the next leader, how populations migrate.
So there's a logic underneath the randomness.
Exactly. The believability comes from the consistency of those underlying rules, combined with the sheer volume of interconnected events over time. It creates this dense web of cause and effect.
And mythology gets woven into this history, too. It's not just like a separate layer added on top.
No, it's absolutely interwoven. Dwarf Fortress generates a pantheon of random deities for each civilization, each with their own spheres of influence, war, fertility, mountains, whatever.
Uh-huh.
And these gods, even though they're just generated entities right now, they become actors in the history simulation. They might curse someone, creating the first vampire or were beast, or they inspire prophets.
So divine intervention is actually simulated.
In a way, yes. You might even see necromancers pop up, taught forbidden secrets by a god or maybe a demon. They build dark towers, raise undead armies, and actually wage war on the living civilizations. They become like a new faction.
Whoa.
And then you have the mega beasts, titans, and forgotten beasts appearing and rampaging. Their attacks, or maybe their deaths at the hands of a hero, are all recorded events in the history.
So connecting this back,
Yeah.
all these dynamics, the wars, the heroes, the monsters, the divine curses, the artifacts being made and stolen, it's all simulated. It's not just flavor text written after the fact.
Precisely. It creates a fully realized history that actually continues, albeit much slower, once you start playing the game.
And you mentioned even more ambitious plans for myth generation.
Yeah, Tarn Adams has talked about wanting a system that generates the entire cosmology and the magical rules from scratch for each world.
So not just random gods, but random types of gods and magic systems.
Exactly. Imagine creation myths that actually define game mechanics. Like maybe in one world, elves literally have scales because their myth says they were born from dragon scales, and that gives them armor.
It's mind-bendingly cool.
Yeah.
Randomizing the structure of reality itself.
It's aiming for a whole new level of emergent world building, yeah.
And speaking of unique things emerging from history, what about artifacts?
Right. As part of that simulation, unique, one-of-a-kind artifacts get created. Legendary swords forged by a possessed dwarf in a strange mood, or maybe a crown worn by a demon prince during some ancient war.
And these items have their own story.
They acquire their own history, yes. They get stolen, lost in dragon hordes, recovered by heroes centuries later, and they get these amazing procedurally generated names and descriptions that often reference their history or their maker. It ties them directly into the world's narrative fabric.
So the lore isn't just told, it's literally written by the world itself, event by event, even down to the names.
It really is, and the naming itself is another whole system.
And the languages.
Yeah. Dwarf Fortress generates distinct constructed fantasy languages for the major races.
Wait, fully random languages every time.
Not quite fully random. They have predefined structures, grammars, sort of. But what is randomized per world is the vocabulary and the mapping of English meanings to the fantasy words.
So the Dwarven word for gold might be different in every world.
Exactly. Dolish in one world, Roth in another, whatever. But the crucial thing is, the names generated using that language are almost always meaningful.
Like your example, ardeshnal, meaning grasp dreams, not just random syllables.
Precisely. It's not just gibberish. It achieves this by constructing names from dictionary words within that generated language. The languages themselves are kept relatively simple. Not a lot of complex grammar, which makes name generation easier, mostly just sticking root words together.
That level of consistency must add so much to the immersion. You're not just seeing random place names.
Immensely. Every name you encounter, people, places, artifacts, even the goblin bandit gangs, is generated using the appropriate cultural language. It adds just tremendous flavor and uniqueness.
Does it generate languages for everyone?
Mostly the main civs. There's also usually a generated divine language used for the names of gods, and apparently a very simplistic kobold language, almost for comic relief, to emphasize their primitive nature.
Okay, so the world isn't just populated with history. It's narrated through these languages and names. How does the procedural text generation work to bring it all together?
Right, this is where all those systems we've talked about really connect for the player. Dwarf Fortress uses procedural text generation constantly. It produces descriptive text for monsters, for artifacts, even for engravings dwarves might carve on walls.
And that text reflects the generated features in history?
Yes. An artifact description might say something like, "This is an ash scepter. It is encircled with bands of llama bone and menaces with spikes of obsidian. On the item is an image of dwarves in Electrum relating to the foundation of guild tombs in the year 125.
Wow, so it pulls the material, the decorations, and a historical event into the description.
Exactly. It dynamically fills in those details based on the item's generated attributes and the world's actual simulated history.
Even combat reports get narrated dynamically. That seems wild.
Yep, blow by blow. It turns the raw simulation data like Unit A hit Unit B's left arm with Weapon X causing Y damage into readable prose. The goblin slashes Eurus McMiner in the left arm, tearing the muscle, that sort of thing.
That's amazing. And for players who want the whole story.
There's the Legends mode. It's basically a built-in encyclopedia. It chronicles all those historical events, figures, sites, artifacts we've been discussing. It turns the raw simulation data logs into something you can actually read and explore.
Incredible depth. But wait, how on earth does it generate something as abstract as poetry or musical forms for different cultures? That sounds like a whole different challenge.
It is, and it's fascinating how they approach it. It's not generating the actual poem text usually. Instead, it generates the rules for poetry and music for each culture.
Rules, like grammar for poems.
Kind of, yeah. It defines things like meter, stanza structure, the intended purpose, maybe a solemn poetic form intended to make an apology, consisting of a single couplet. It sets rules for syllable counts, themes, stylistic features. It creates a mini grammar for that culture's art forms.
So it describes how they would write a poem, not the poem itself.
Mostly, yes. Though sometimes descriptions of art might reference these generated forms, it's another subtle layer showing cultural distinctiveness.
That's a layer of depth most players probably don't even consciously register, but it adds to the overall feel.
Absolutely. And ultimately, all this procedural text is the most direct way the player experiences the world generation. It's crucial for immersion. It provides that connective tissue between the raw data and the feeling of a real, storied place. As people say, Dwarf Fortress generates tales so expansive no human could ever explore them all.
A saga written just for you. Indeed. Okay, moving on slightly. What about the creatures, the unique monsters, and also the everyday characters?
Right. Dwarf Fortress is famous for its procedurally generated mega beasts. You've got titans, which roam the surface, forgotten beasts, their subterranean counterparts, and also demons from the underworld. And crucially, these are unique to each generated world.
So you won't fight the same titan twice in different worlds. How does it make them unique?
It uses what you could call a template mashup technique. It starts by picking a basic form, maybe a quadruped, maybe a blob, maybe an insectoid. Then it picks a material, could be something normal like flesh or stone, or something wild like fire or steam or green glass.
And glass? Seriously?
Yeah. Then it adds various body parts, wings, extra tails, multiple heads, stingers, trunks, and finally special attacks, venomous bites, fire breath, poisonous vapors, webs.
So you could genuinely end up fighting, I don't know, Nguso the colossal moth, a gigantic three-eyed moth made of green glass with a long trunk that sprays poisonous vapors.
That's exactly the kind of thing it generates. It leads to this incredible variety. Some are terrifyingly dangerous, made of like steel with deadly attacks. Others might be, well, less threatening. Maybe a giant blob made of salt.
Yeah, not exactly scaled to the player, though.
Definitely not. And remember, these megabeasts aren't just random encounters. They become historical figures. Their rampages, maybe where they lair, their eventual death. It all gets recorded in the world's legends.
Feeds back into the narrative. Okay, so that's the big monsters. But what about the individuals? The dwarves in your fort, the humans in towns. Do they just feel like generic NPCs?
Not at all. That's another incredibly deep layer.
Okay.
Every single individual creature, dwarves, humans, elves, goblins, even the generated monsters to some extent gets a detailed, procedurally assigned personality profile.
That's every single one. How detailed.
It's got about 30 different personality facets, things like cheerfulness, anxiety, vanity, gregariousness, compassion, all rated on a 0 to 100 scale. These are randomized, but usually around averages specific to their species.
So dwarves might tend to be less cheerful than elves, maybe.
Something like that, yeah. Plus, they get other procedural details. Physical appearance descriptors, long braided brown hair, hazel eyes, a prominent jaw, random preferences for food, drinks, materials, animals, even chosen dreams and life goals.
That's staggering, the level of detail for potentially thousands of individuals.
It is, and the fascinating thing is how this fuels emergent storytelling. It's not scripted. You might get a mayor who keeps demanding gold statues because their randomly generated greed value is super high. That situation just emerges from their personality profile.
So individual behavior stems from these generated traits.
Exactly, and it goes even further. Entire civilizations get procedurally assigned cultural values, too. Maybe one civ highly values warfare, another values artistry, another values nature. These cultural values then influence the average personalities of their members and even the kind of art they produce. A warlike civ might depict more battles in their engravings.
It all interconnects. Okay, it's clear Dwarf Fortress is an absolute masterclass in this kind of deep, single-player procedural generation.
Sure.
But the second part of our mission, how on earth do you translate that level of complexity to a persistent, real-time multiplayer server? like ServUO for Ultima Online?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It's a huge challenge. UO maps are traditionally static, handcrafted. DF generates everything, but it takes time, and it's offline.
So what's the goal for adapting it? You can't regenerate the world constantly in multiplayer.
Right. The goal would typically be to generate a fresh, unique world map. Civilizations, dungeons, basic lore each time the server is wiped or started anew. Ideally done offline or maybe during server startup before players log in.
Okay, so let's break that down. How would you tackle the world map in UO using DF principles?
You'd adapt the height map approach. Use algorithms like Diamond Square or maybe Perlin or Simplex Noise, likely implemented in C# for ServUO scripting. Generate that basic elevation data.
And the rivers. Getting realistic water flow sounds tricky in UO's tile system.
It is tricky. But you can borrow from DFS erosion idea. Identify high points, do downhill pathfinding to carve river channels, maybe widen them based on simulated flow volume. It wouldn't be as detailed as DF's simulation, but it could create convincing river networks.
Okay, height map, rivers, then biomes.
Same principle as DF, but simplified. Classify areas based on parameters. You can derive temperature from latitude and elevation, maybe moisture based on distance from coasts or those generated rivers, then map those classifications onto UO-specific terrain tiles. Grass, sand, snow, forest floor, etc.
Makes sense. What about roads? Essential for multiplayer travel.
Yeah, you definitely want to generate roads connecting major points of interest, probably the starting towns of the different civilizations. Standard pathfinding algorithms like A could work well for creating logical travel routes across the generated terrain.
And technically, how would you get this map into the game?
Couple of options. You could generate the actual UO map files, .mol files, completely offline before starting the server. Or potentially integrate the generation code directly into ServUO scripts. For dynamic updates to players already online, if you were doing smaller changes, something like the Ultima Live project might be needed to push map changes to clients.
Okay, map generation seems feasible, if complex. What about civilizations and settlements? DF simulates millennia of history. How do you condense that for ServUO?
You can't realistically run a full DF-style history sim. It's too slow, too resource-intensive for a server startup, so you'd go for a history-light approach.
History-light.
Yeah. Define your basic cultures or factions, humans, elves, orcs, maybe undead. Place their starting towns in appropriate biomes on your generated map, making sure they're reasonably spaced out.
Okay, basic setup. Then the lead history.
For flavor, you randomly generate some initial conditions. Maybe decide which factions start allied or at war. Generate a few key past events like, this village here was destroyed in the Orc War 50 years ago and is now haunted. Simple stuff, but enough to provide context and maybe some immediate quest hooks for players exploring.
So backstory snippets rather than a full simulation. Smart. And the towns themselves.
You could use template-based systems, pre-designed building blocks, arranged procedurally or more complex procedural layout algorithms for the town structures, then populate them with NPCs, merchants, guards, a leader, making sure their names fit the culture using maybe simpler versions of DF's language generation.
Right. And the wilderness needs monsters.
Mm.
How do you handle spawns in a dynamic world?
That links back to the biomes and factions. You can assign regions of the map to certain factions or general danger levels. That then dictates the appropriate monster spawns. Orc camps get orc warbands nearby. Evil swamps get swamp creatures. It makes the world feel logically populated, borrowing directly from DF's idea of biome-based creature placement.
Gotcha. Okay, what about dungeons? That classic UO experience. Can we get that DF feel of unique, twisty caves and ruins?
Definitely. You'd likely use different techniques for different dungeon types to get variety. For natural caves, cellular automata are great simple rules that create complex, organic-looking tunnels. Or maybe Perlin worms, another algorithm for cave-like structures.
And for man-made dungeons, old ruins, castles.
For those, something like binary space partitioning, BSP, works well. It recursively divides the dungeon area, creating more structured rooms and hallways. You could even mix in some prefabricated room designs, prefabs, for key areas within the procedural layout.
Can these be multi-level?
Sure, either by generating on separate map facets if the server supports that, or more simply by simulating levels using teleporters or ladder connections between different areas on the main map.
And filling these dungeons, loot, bosses.
You'd populate them with appropriate NPC spawns based on the dungeon type and region, maybe place a unique boss at the end. Loot generation could borrow from DF2 randomized item properties, maybe even procedurally generated item descriptions for rare finds. Add some procedural traps and secrets for good measure.
This all sounds amazing, but brings us back to the practicalities. Generation time for all this and consistency on a live server, those seem like huge hurdles.
They absolutely are. The generation time is critical. For a full world gen like this, it almost has to be done offline during server downtime or before a fresh launch. You can't have players waiting minutes or hours for the world to build.
And consistency.
Paramount. Every player logging in must see the exact same generated world. The map, the towns, the dungeon layouts, they have to be identical for everyone. Once generated, the world's state should ideally only change through player actions or planned server events, unless you're doing something like seasonal resets where a new world is generated periodically.
Which many multiplayer games do, actually.
Right. And then there are the technical challenges. Ensuring your generation code is scalable, thread-safe if parts run concurrently, and just debugging the inevitable weirdness that procedural generation throws up, especially in a live environment. But using modular generation steps helps manage that complexity.
One thing that really stood out from DF was the dynamic text. Can that be adapted for ServUO to bring the generated world to life?
Yes, and that's where you can really inject the DF flavor and make the generated lore accessible to players in-game.
How so?
NPCs could use generated names for their city or nearby landmarks when they greet players. Town criers or message boards could list the current generated lord's name and maybe a small generated recent event fact.
Oh, neat. Like, beware the goblin raids near the Crooked Hills.
Exactly. Or you could generate in-game lore books at server startup. These could describe the different factions, their randomly generated starting relationships, maybe a brief summary of those history-light events.
Right.
Very much like a simplified Legends mode from DF.
So players could actually find books in the world that explain the unique history of their specific server.
Precisely. It allows players to organically discover the narrative of the world they're in, making that generated landscape and its history feel much more meaningful. Every server wipe becomes a genuinely fresh discovery.
What a journey this has been. From the fractal noise-shaping mountains, literally down to the generated grammar for poetry and the names of gods. Dwarf Fortress just showcases the profound possibilities of procedural generation.
It really does create these incredibly deep, simulated, emergent fantasy worlds unlike anything else.
And by adapting these techniques, maybe simplifying them but keeping the core ideas, we can potentially bring a similar level of depth, or at least uniqueness, to multiplayer games like ServUO.
It's about taking that essence, the emergence, the history, the uniqueness, and making it work within the very different constraints of a persistent online environment, creating dynamic worlds that feel genuinely new and storied each time.
So what does this all mean for you, the player? Well, imagine stepping into a brand new world every time you join a server, where every mountain range, every ruined city you stumble upon, every bizarre creature you encounter has its own unique, unscripted story just waiting for you to discover it.
A saga written just for you by the very world itself.